With trembling hands, Sarah pulled the key from her pocket, and its metal paled against her fingertips. A faint glimmer of hope mingled with the overwhelming weight of humility, as the faint hum of distant traffic and the rustle of dry leaves filled the cold evening air around her. Each step towards the door was like a journey through years of pain and lost dreams, each step resurrecting memories she tried to suppress. There was no other way out, and maybe the 8th chance for a miracle would finally happen. Something good was going to happen in her life. She had just been released from prison after years of confinement, and now she could adjust to life again. But what kind of life awaited her? Her husband had abandoned her, her parents had passed away early, and thank God they hadn't lived to see her disgrace. And the loss of Emma, a few friends seemed to remain. At least they hadn't stopped talking to her altogether. Emily even visited her from time to time. Sarah didn't want to become a burden, so she appreciated their support and help, though it often made her feel even stranger in her own existence. Her plan was to try and get into her apartment first. After all, it had been bought during the marriage, and she still technically owned it. Her friends had urged her not to do it, not wanting her to get even more upset. They were sure her husband wasn't expecting her. Emily had blabbed something similar, so Sarah didn't hold out hope that her key would work. But still, she didn't give up hope. Faith in a miracle, childish naivete that stubbornly refused to die. The festive atmosphere of New Year's Eve was still faintly felt. Strings of twinkling lights adorned the windows, and faint sounds of holiday music came from the distant apartments. Sarah remembered New Year's Eve many years ago, when she and David had toasted with cheap champagne, laughed at the modest decorations, and dreamed of a bright future. The contrast between that joyous night and the present reality felt like a knife stabbing into her chest. It was a time when people had to make decisions, to start over. But for Sarah, it was a cruel reminder of a world to which she no longer belonged. It seemed a new life was to begin, but the reality was different. Nothing good was in store. She had served her time in prison, and this stain would stay with her forever. But she allowed herself to dream, if only for a moment. Smiling to herself, Sarah inserted the key into the lock. To her surprise, the lock turned easily, as if she had just returned from work after all these years. The thought made her smile bittersweetly. She imagined cooking dinner and waiting for her husband. Then the thought of him hit her like a bucket of cold water, and she sobered, almost laughing at her own stupidity. Of course he wasn't expecting her. There was no need to cook for him. Why hadn't he changed the lock? Probably out of laziness. David wasn't the type to make an effort unless absolutely necessary. He'd probably cut her out of his life long ago, though he hadn't divorced her. Sarah hesitated as she crossed the threshold of the apartment and smelled the familiar odor of old wood and faint perfume. To her surprise, she was greeted by a stranger. The young woman looked frightened at first, but after a few moments her expression became angry. She opened her mouth, preparing to scream, but stopped abruptly. Instead, she approached Sarah, her presence assertive yet cautious. "Who are you?" the stranger demanded angrily, her voice trembling slightly. Sarah didn't have time to answer before an older woman's voice came from the other room. "Charlotte? What's going on?" It was David's mother, Margaret, entering the room. Sarah hadn't expected to see her here. Margaret's eyes widened at the sight of her former daughter-in-law. Grabbing Charlotte's arm, she stared at Sarah with a mixture of indignation and thinly veiled fear. "You have no right to be here. I have to call the police," Margaret snapped in a sharply raised voice. Sarah forced herself to smile tiredly, though her heart was pounding frantically. "That won't be necessary, Margaret. I've served my time, and legally I still own half of this apartment." Margaret's face flushed, a mixture of embarrassment and anger reflected on it. "That's impossible. It hasn't even been 10 years yet." "It really is." "I was released early for good behavior," Sarah replied calmly, though there was a note of defiance in her voice. She glanced at Charlotte, who stepped back slightly. "And who are you?" Charlotte's gaze darted nervously between Sarah and Margaret, her confidence wavering. Margaret didn't answer. Instead, she began to stammer, trying to ignore Sarah's presence altogether. But Sarah didn't care about arguing. All she wanted to do was pack her things and leave. "Don't worry," Sarah said. "I'm not going to stay. I just need my things." She walked to the balcony where the box containing her things stood. The box was dusty, its edges frayed from years of neglect. Inside, she found a faded photo album, a cracked mug she had once used for her morning coffee, and a small box containing her wedding ring. Each item carried the weight of her former life, evoking bitter and sweet memories. Even the clothes, musty and moth-eaten, seemed like fragments of a person she hardly recognized. When she touched them, her heart was filled with longing and sadness. Thankful that they had not been thrown away, she began to take them apart. The things were old and mostly useless, but she took what she could carry. As she walked outside with the box, she struggled to hold back tears. 7 years had passed, and there was nothing left of her former life. Sitting on the curb waiting for a cab, she reflected on how quickly time had flown by in retrospect, but how agonizingly slow it had dragged on day after day in prison. The loneliness, the endless string of monotonous days, and the constant struggle to maintain her dignity under harsh conditions had hardened her and left deep scars. Memories of her life before prison came flooding back to her with renewed vigor. She and David had only been married for 2 years before everything fell apart. They'd saved up for an apartment, selling everything they could to afford it. David's father even sold his car to help with the down payment, much to Margaret's fury. Margaret had never approved of Sarah, thinking her unworthy of her son. Sarah had hoped that time would soften her mother-in-law's contempt, but it only worsened. A week after the wedding, David's father died. Suddenly, an autopsy revealed that he had been poisoned. Suspicion immediately fell on Sarah. Margaret accused her of trying to eliminate David's family in order to get the apartment to herself, and told everyone tales of Sarah's alleged greed and ambition. She emphasized Sarah's rural upbringing, insinuating that Sarah's desperation to escape her past drove her to commit a terrible act. The evidence against Sarah was flimsy, but convincing. Poison was found in the lining of her jacket, though Sarah had no idea how it had gotten there. Despite pleading not guilty, Sarah was sentenced to 10 years in prison. The betrayal hurt her deeply, especially knowing that David thought she was guilty. Her family had tried to find and peacefully settle with her, yet it was basically thrown away. Now sitting on the curb, Sarah tried to piece together the events that had led to her imprisonment. She thought about Margaret's unwavering hatred and how she had always preferred appearances to the truth. The night before, Sarah had found something hidden in her jacket, a false purple fingernail, identical to the one Margaret had worn at her wedding. The realization struck her like lightning. Margaret had set her up. The next morning, Sarah met with Margaret. At first, Margaret refused to let her into the house, but Sarah's insistence broke through. Inside, Margaret's defenses crumbled. She fell to her knees and, sobbing, confessed everything. Margaret acted out of desperation and jealousy, unable to bear the thought of Sarah inheriting the apartment. She poisoned and arranged for Sarah's death. The weight of guilt had tormented her for years, and this confession seemed to give a welcome release to her inner torment. Later that day, Sarah shared Margaret's confession with David. He didn't believe it at first, but Sarah recorded the conversation. After listening to his mother's words, David was devastated. He apologized to Sarah, gave up his rights to the apartment, and agreed to a divorce. Although the lost years could never be regained, Sarah felt somewhat vindicated. She decided to forgive Margaret, leaving judgment to a higher power. Back in her apartment, Sarah took a deep breath, determined to rebuild her life, no matter how shattered the foundation seemed. Enough. Thank you for listening to this story. If you enjoyed it, please support the channel by liking and sharing. Your support means a lot to us. Until next time.